Hello, welcome. This video is going to be about one-to-one counterpoint and specifically composing one-to-one counterpoint over a cantus firmus. Most of the information from this video comes from Jacob Grans YouTube video on one-to-one counterpoint. He's teaching from the book Gradus Parnassum, sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly, from the 1720s. Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn are just a few of the great composers that were taught from or studied from this book. In this video, I am reviewing the information that I have gathered about the one-to-one counterpoint video that he made, and I'm going to basically go over the notes that I jotted down from his video. I'm going to do the exercise just like he did throughout his video, but I'm going to be doing it like he walked through with it, and then at the end of it he shared some exercises for us to do, and I can also share those with you if you want to see those. So, cantus firmus is Latin for given melody. Usually this is pretty short, somewhere in between 8 to 12 notes. The teacher provides the student with a given melody, and the student must then compose a new melody to go with it. So here's the first example of the cantus firmus. The nature of the cantus firmus is the least amount of notes that are still recognizable as a complete composition. The only things that are necessary are included in the cantus firmus. This means you will not see directly repeated notes. You will also not see groups of notes being repeated like in a melody. This is because the cantus firmus is supposed to be a representation of the composition that is in a whole form, meaning that it cannot be further subdivided. When composing polyphonic music, we want to make it easy for the listener to follow the multiple melodies that are being played, and a great way to do that would be to make sure that the melodies are melodically fluent with each other. Melodic fluency has nothing to do with a single melody itself having just a nice sound to it for the listener. Instead, it means that the melody is very easy for the listener to keep track of and remember. The cantus is stepwise for the most part, meaning that it's just using the intervals of seconds, using the notes of the scale. It makes it easy for the listener when they can predict that the melody will be going somewhere close by, meaning progressing up the scale without skipping up from one note to another, but going from one note to the next adjacent note in the scale, either below or above it. And if going in one direction, for example, if we take a note then ascend up to the next note in our scale, then the note after that can keep ascending too. This will make it even more predictable for the listener, but you never want too much predictability, so if you just keep going and going, then the listener will just go, okay, it's just going to keep going up the scale. So of course, you use that to the advantage of having some things that are predictable, but then also weaving away from that and also having some unpredictable things, making it musical. The cantus is not going to be leaping around from one note to another note. That would be unpredictable for the listener. And remember, the whole point of this is to have something that is easy to follow. So if it is predictable, it is easier to follow, but like I was saying, if the whole thing is completely predictable, then it's not very musical. If the cantus does leap, then it leaps by a consonant interval. Our consonant leaps include the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and octave. Our dissonant leaps include the seventh, an augmented or diminished interval of any sort, or anything that is greater than an octave. So with that, you can't use the fourth degree with the seventh degree, and you can't use the seventh degree with the fourth degree in the scale, because that's going to be creating that tritone. For example, in C major, if you had the notes B and F, or F and B, you're not going to be able to use those when creating an interval. Leaps are usually recovered by a stepwise motion in the opposite direction. This means if you leap up, you're going to go stepwise down. If you leap down, you're going to go stepwise up. This recovery only refers to large leaps, anything larger than a third. It is also more important for upward leaps than it is for downward leaps. And the guy, Jacob Grans, was explaining that there's a gravity to your melody. So he was saying if you throw your melody up in the air, it's going to have a gravity that wants to go down. And metaphorically, he was explaining that if you're then going to go down, it's not going to have the same amount of gravitational pull to it, which I found interesting and something to consider when creating that recovery. One good note is that in box compositions, melodic leaps of fourths are found. For example, measures 1, 3, and 8 of Suite 3 Minuet BWV 814. It is good to think imaginatively when it comes to music. We can think of our leap like a ball being thrown up into the air, and we can associate the leap with a sense of weight to it. So the bigger the leap means the more weight. What comes up must come down. So as our note leaps up in the air like a ball, we can use descending notes to help it fall back down. This also helps the listener to predict and follow what is coming next. And in my rules to one counterpoint video, I talked about the gap and fill method, which is that you have a gap and you fill it with what the listener would expect. So if you want to learn more about that, just check out that video. I'll have it linked in the description. So it's essentially the rule of what comes up must come down. As our note leaps in the air like a ball, we can use descending notes to help it fall back down. This also helps the listener predict and follow what is going to come next. The cantus firmus only starts on scale degree 1, which is also called our tonic. All of our melodies will end on our tonic as well. Or in other words, do in solfege. This stable note gives the melody its great sense of conclusion. We must begin on the tonic because before the other voices are written, we don't know if this note is going to be used as a line in the bass or possibly an inner voice or maybe even a top voice. If it is going to be used in the bass line, then it must start on scale degree 1. This will give the listener a sense of what key we are in. We want this short music phrase, the cantus, to have a good beginning, middle, and end. And the tonic can help us create a stable beginning and end. Since our melody is going to start and end in the same place, we need a point of a peak that will take us away from the stability of the tonic and will clearly take us away from the state of rest at the beginning and the end. So this will act as an in-between section of the beginning and the end, which will further enhance the goal of melodic motion. Because of this, our melodic fluent melody has a high point that resides somewhere in the middle. So it's good to keep in mind that it's near the middle. It's not always in the direct center, and oftentimes it's not. So you don't have to think about too much of getting it directly in the middle of the melody, just somewhere in the middle. This high point is a consonant interval away from the tonic. For example, Salieri's high point was a sixth above the tonic. Now the cantus firmus has a sense of goal-directed motion as it ascends to the high point. So goal-directed motion, this is something that Jacob Grans was saying in his videos. This is something that maybe he made up or got from somewhere, but it's his words. As we ascend, we increase our potential energy of the melody, just like a rolling ball up a hill from the bottom. As you go up, the potential energy to come back down increases. Now in the second half of the melody, that energy gets released through fluent stepwise motion back to scale degree 1, our tonic. Now that the nature of the cantus firmus is established, and we have concluded the melody with melodic fluency, we can move on to the next step. Okay, so now let's look at this melody here, this cantus firmus, the given melody that's given to us. Let's analyze the intervals that are happening between note to note and see the leaps and the stepwise motions, and let's also look at the peak and then how that peak is then resolved, and then also how that goes stepwise back to the tonic, leading us to the conclusion, the end. Okay, so the first thing that happens is the first note leaps up to the second note using a fourth. And as you can see, I wrote 4 up there just to show you the interval that's happening. And then from this note, it goes down to the next note using stepwise motion, so it's a second. Then that note leaps back up to the next note using a fourth. So if we observe now, we went up a fourth, we went down a step, we went up a fourth again. So in context from our tonic, now we are up a sixth from the tonic, which is a consonant interval away from the tonic, and this is our high point. So that checks off the fact that it's a consonant interval away from the tonic, and we have this tonic, and then also checks off that the next note recovers it using stepwise motion going down, since we just leaped up to this peak. Next we have stepwise motion again, and we actually have stepwise motion all the way back to the tonic. It's very simple. It's good to interpret this because there's going to be a point to where you're not going to have a given melody. So you're going to have to create your own cantus firmus or foundation to the counterpoint. So just a quick analyzation again. We go up a fourth, as you can see. We go down that second stepwise motion. We go up a fourth again. We're at that high point, a sixth away from that tonic where we started from. And now that we are at that high point, a consonant interval away from the tonic, we are now using stepwise motion all the way back down to our tonic. Okay, so now that we have that given melody, the student has to get this cantus firmus and create a response or a solution to the melody. This new melody is called the counterpoint. The counterpoint is also melodically fluent. It follows all of the same rules that govern our steps and leaps in the given melody. The counterpoint does two things that our given melody does not. First, the counterpoint can begin on scale degrees 1 as well as 5. And let's get a little more specific. So when a counterpoint is written above the given melody, it can begin on scale degrees 1 or 5. But when a counterpoint is written below the given melody and it acts as a bass line, it must begin on scale degree 1 because it has to let the listener know what key we are in. The reason for not starting on the third scale degree is because once we begin to compose inventions, fugues, and other types of contrapuntal forms, starting on the third will lead us to many issues, so it's good just to not have that as a habit. In all of Bach's fugues from both Well-Tempered Clavier books 1 and 2, as well as the two-part inventions, he never begins on the median. The counterpoint does not have to follow the same shape as the given melody, nor does it have to invert the shape. We don't want this to be exact. Remember, we want some predictability to it, and that has to do with the shape, but we also want a little bit of surprise as well. We want this to be musical. But as the main idea of what's going on with this given melody and the counterpoint is there must be a way that the two shapes or curves of the melody interact, whatever that might be. And we're going to go into this a little later, but you'll see oftentimes a really good counterpoint will do something to where when the bottom voice is moving down, the top voice is moving up, and vice versa. If the bottom voice is moving up, then the top voice is moving down. So they're contradicting each other in motion. But again, we're going to get into this a lot more later. These are the things that make up a good counterpoint that is easy to follow. Our counterpoint can repeat tones every once in a while if there's a good reason to do. This should be kept to a minimum. That would be pointless to do in our given melody because it's supposed to be the smallest form of the composition that cannot be further subdivided, but there would be reasons why we would want to do this in our counterpoint. For example, the counterpoint could repeat two tones while at the same time the given melody leaps up a consonant interval, causing the listener to close more of their attention in on the leap rather than the two repeated tones. Repeating tones should be kept to a minimum because if we repeat too many tones, then that will cause the listener to only pay attention to the voices that are moving. There are two rules on how the counterpoint and the given melody can interact. First, the exercise cannot contain dissonant harmonic intervals. A harmonic interval refers to the interval between the two voices that are harmonizing. There are three types of harmonic intervals. Perfect harmonic intervals, which are also known as perfect consonances. These are the unison, the perfect fifth, and the octave. These are the most stable intervals, and because of that, they by themselves are too stable. The voices will sound stuck together if we comprise a melody of just unison, perfect fifth, or octave, and it's all doing that throughout the melody. You're not going to hear two different voices. This can hinder the flow of your melody if they are used too much. Because of this, you should avoid using perfect consonances 2 times in a row. Unisons are the strongest of the perfect consonances, so they should only be used at the first or last harmonic interval of the exercise and nowhere else. Next, we have imperfect harmonic intervals, or imperfect consonances. These are the thirds, sixths, and tenths. With the name imperfect, it gives these notes a rather bad connotation, but these are the most useful harmonic intervals when it comes to counterpoint. The voices sound like they harmonize in agreement together, but they do not sound like they are stuck together like perfect consonances. So it doesn't just sound like one sort of voice. You can definitely distinguishly hear two separate voices and it sounds like they're harmonizing together, so it makes a nice sound. And last, we have the dissonant harmonic intervals, or dissonances. These are the seconds, fourths, sevenths, and augmented or diminished intervals. The sound of dissonant harmonic intervals is unstable and sounds like the harmonies are in disagreement of one another, repelling each other, just like when magnets are pushed together at their same polarities. Because of this, when wanting to create voice leading independence, our dissonant harmonic intervals are actually our best choice. The melodies will be able to sound very independent if they're able to clash with each other. However, the first rule of one-to-one counterpoint states that dissonant harmonic intervals cannot be used in these exercises. Once you move on to the next 2-to-1 counterpoint and further than that, you will be able to use dissonant intervals. So the example that he shows goes over Salieri's cantus firmus, and then it's Franz Schubert's answer or counterpoint to that. So we will be examining Schubert's counterpoint. Okay, so in the video he's actually showing you Salieri's cantus firmus and then Franz Schubert's answer or counterpoint to that. So we're going to be looking at the same thing. So right here is Salieri's cantus firmus, which we already looked at. So now we're going to look at Franz Schubert's counterpoint, his answer to this cantus firmus. Okay, so on the left we have the counterpoint that Schubert responded with, and on the right we have the counterpoint with the given melody. The other thing to note is that there are 2 repeated tones in the counterpoint. And at the same time, our lower voice did a leap of a sixth, while again, that upper note was just staying the same note. Another thing to note is that if we look at the whole thing, we have all imperfect consonances, except for, of course, the end where we have that tonic, where we have the lower tonic note and the upper tonic note an octave higher, just creating that octave telling us that we're finished. Other than that, there's not one perfect consonants. Imperfect consonances are the best intervals to use when wanting the music to have a sense of forward flow. Schubert also mixes up the types of intervals being used to give a sense of variety. Before moving on to step 2 of one-to-one counterpoint, we must be familiar with 3 possible ways that the 2 melodic lines can move in relationship to one another. Rule 1 is that there are no dissonant harmonic intervals. There are 3 types of motion that counterpoint can follow. Number 1 is contrary motion. This is the best motion for creating a sense of an independent melody. This is what I was talking about when one voice goes up and the other voice goes down and vice versa. 2 is direct motion. This is when 2 voices move together in the same direction. They sound as if they are moving together, so it is not as good for creating 2 independently moving melodies. And in direct motion, there are 2 different types of direct motion. There is parallel motion when 2 voices move in the same exact direction by the same exact interval. Think about perfect fifths, perfect octaves. So when one goes up a fifth, the other one goes up a fifth. They're the exact same thing. And then there is similar motion. So 2 voices move in the same direction but not the same interval. So maybe one moves up a fifth, the other one moves up a third, but they're still moving in similar motion. So for example, we have parallel motion. So we have C to G and then we have E to B. So C to G, E to B, it's a fifth and it's going up a third in both of them to another fifth. So the 2 fifths are moving in parallel motion. In other words, it's remaining a fifth interval. It's just moving up or down. Next we have similar motion. So we have E and B, and then we also have F and D. E to F is up a step, while B to D is up a third. Parallel motion should be avoided the most because it is the least independent for the two separate voices to be able to move. We should avoid long lines of parallel intervals because the 2 separate voices will sound stuck together. But this is not only because they're using the perfect consonances, but because they are using parallel motion. On the last one, you really can't hear the two voices separately that much. And a lot of people have theorized this is because the octave is the first overtone in the overtone series. Oblique motion is the last type of voice leading, which we've already seen. This is when one voice moves while the other voice is stationary, remaining where it is and not moving. So oblique motion is not moving. The voice just stays where it is. This will only happen in one-to-one counterpoint when we compose a repeated tone in our counterpoint. Oblique motion allows for the moving voice to have voice leading independence. This allows for more independence than direct motion, but if we overuse the oblique motion, then the listener will focus on the moving voice as it becomes much more interesting melodically. Doing so, it will cause the listener to stop paying equal attention to the two voices. It is recommended to only use repeated tones when it really feels necessary. And by necessary, this means that you don't really have another choice in your counterpoint other than using this, especially if you're trying to get the end result that you're looking for. Contrary motion is the best for creating an independent melody, but there can always be too much of a good thing. We want our counterpoint to have an unpredictable variety of motions that will help create the most interesting possible sounding voice line. In conclusion, contrary motion is the best. When the cantus firmus goes from a note up or down to the next note, the counterpoint does the opposite. Okay, so let's really keep in mind that there's no direct motion to perfect consonances, and especially not parallel motion to perfect consonances. We preferably want contrary motion to perfect consonances if we're going to be moving to a perfect consonance. This makes a lot of sense when we think about it. Our direct motion is the most stuck together form of voice leading, and the perfect consonances are the most stuck together type of harmonic interval. Okay, so an example of direct motion, and here we have similar motion, moving from F to D to C to G. It's similar motion because F to C and also D to G are ascending up, but they're not ascending at the same interval, so it is similar motion, not parallel motion. Examining it, it went from a sixth interval here to a fifth interval here. Since we use direct motion to lead us to a perfect harmonic interval, this won't sound very good. Even worse would be if we had parallel motion leading us to the perfect harmonic interval. And that would be known as parallel fifths or octaves. So right here we have some parallel fifths. And remember, the goal of counterpoint is not simple harmony. It is to create two independent voices that complement one another. The voices may sound boring or incomplete by themselves, but if they sound good together, that is what we want. It would be even better if they sound good by themselves and together. That's probably the best goal. In Schubert's case, the only perfect consonant interval that he uses is the octave at the very end. And it was safely approached by contrary motion. If you see, the second to last note is here. You lead up a step to the last note, and then on the bottom voice. So as you can see on the second to last note, the upper voice leads up a step to our last note, and then our lower voice goes a step down to our last note. So there's that contrary motion. The end cadence consists of scale degree 2 and a sixth above that, then goes to scale degree 1 with an octave above it. This sixth above our second scale degree is our leading tone. Since we start on the second scale degree, now our sixth interval above that is our seventh scale degree. This is why we changed the seventh scale degree a half step in the minor, so we can have this same cadence at the very end. But before talking about minor, let's talk about writing a counterpoint below the cantus firmus, below the given melody. The process one uses to write a counterpoint below a given melody is almost the same as when writing a counterpoint above. The most important thing to know is that the counterpoint must start on scale degree 1. Very often you'll be writing for a low point instead of a high point since you're writing underneath. So instead of looking at the cantus firmus as having a peak, now we have a valley created with our lower counterpoint. And again, we want to avoid repeated tones as much as possible, direct motion and perfect consonances, and especially direct motion to perfect consonances. We do this as much as we can so we can distinguish the two voices from one another. So here, instead of starting an octave above or doing that fifth as you could do going above in the counterpoint, going below, Schubert just chooses to do a unison of the same note, and then from there we go to a third, which then goes in parallel motion to another third, contrary motion to a sixth, contrary motion back into a third, contrary motion back out to a sixth, parallel motion to another sixth, and then contrary motion to the third. And then you could think of this as contrary motion back to the unison, since they're both going back to that same note. Well, the first step, you could look at that as similar motion because the first two notes go to two different intervals. Composing an exercise using the minor mode does not change very much. We can raise our scale degree 7 by a semitone in order to create lead tone function in our minor scale. This is just raising the 7th degree, so now it is a semitone below the tonic or semitone away from the tonic. This is what is meant by lead tone function, 1/2 step below the tonic. This will require us to mark an accidental. As you can see right here, we have this sharp marked, and that is the second to last note, showing us that this is the lead tone going to the tonic. As you can see, it is one semitone below the tonic. So you mark it a sharp if it is originally natural in that natural minor scale. You'd mark it a natural if it's a flat originally in the scale, and you'd mark it a double sharp if it is already a sharp in the scale. Doing this is called raising the lead tone. This is customary for a cadence in the minor mode. This also turns our minor 5 chord into a major 5 chord, which now has dominant function. And furthermore, our major 5 chord will become the dominant 7th of the chords when the chords are turned into 7th chords using the notes that are in the diatonic scale that we're using at the time. Which is just like how the major 5 functions in the major scale. And a lot of this has to do with the third of the 5 chord being that lead tone, whether it is a 7th chord or it is just the 5 chord. We want to keep in mind of being careful about dissonant harmonic intervals when going from one note to the next. For example, a D and an F to an A and a C sharp. So as you can see right here, we have a D and an F, which goes to an A and a C sharp using contrary motion. But the only problem is when you leap from an F to a C sharp, it is a dissonant diminished fourth, which would be an error in most teachers' eyes. If both the C sharps in the middle were replaced with C, then this would solve this problem. We would have to change both of our C sharps to C, because C followed by C sharp would technically be an augmented unison, which would be a dissonant melodic interval. Okay, so now we're still in the minor mode, and we're still going to use the given melody as the one right before this, and instead this is just going to be the counterpoint written below the given melody. So you may notice one thing, and that's that this is nearly identical to the response written above this cantus. The only difference is that one of the C sharps is replaced with a D. Above, if there was a D, that would have made a dissonant perfect fourth interval, but below it is now a perfect fifth interval. And you can see that right here, those middle two C sharps, now this one is a D, and this one is still a C sharp. Other than that, it is the same exact response. So this could be one of the reasons why originally he had those two C sharps, because now he was able to do something which is known as invertible counterpoint, which means no matter which way the counterpoint is going, it's still going to function with the given melody. Okay, so now the time has come to create our own counterpoint against a given melody. This cantus firmus here was composed by Francis Joseph Fétis. It is on the longer side with having 15 notes, but it is a great example for writing a counterpoint response. Okay, so you don't have to compose your counterpoint from beginning to end. We know our counterpoint must end on scale degree 1. So additionally, this is the last interval, and it is a perfect interval, so it must be approached in contrary motion. If the given melody descends a step to our tonic, then our counterpoint must ascend preferably the note that would ascend a step, which in this case would be our tonic. So if the given melody, as you can see here, descends to our tonic using a step, then our counterpoint must ascend preferably the note that would ascend up only a step. In this case is our tonic, so it's that note C. So the note right below C would be B. So now we have B going to C, and we also have D going down to C. This creates the cadence that has the sixth interval progressing to an octave using contrary motion. This is the most standard melodic cadence. So we can start our counterpoint on scale degree 1, which forms an octave. On scale degree 5, which forms a fifth. It is good to think about writing the exercises in the range of the human voice, known as cantable. Our given melody is written in the alto range, while our counterpoint is written in the soprano range. A lot of times, naturally, one would want to pick a starting note and compose the song each note one at a time from start to finish. But instead of that, it could be a good idea to practice and compose in medium-sized chunks. So my choice for the first note of the counterpoint can differ depending on the first section of the given melody, which in this case is stepwise motion using C, D, and E. Okay, so one option could be putting a C, forming an octave, and then going to B, forming a sixth interval, and then going parallel motion to C, forming another sixth. That is a good idea, but here is a different idea. We begin on G, forming a fifth, then we move in contrary motion to F, forming a third, and then we go to G using parallel motion, forming another third. This is a good choice because our goal for counterpoint is for it to have a nice shape, which would ascend to a high point and then descend back to scale degree 1, just like our given melody did. Also, by starting on this lower note G, we now have the capability to create a distinguishable accent up to our high point, which will in turn make a more obvious goal-directed shape. Since the point of counterpoint is creating a separate sounding voice, we want our high point to occur at a different time that is in our given melody. With that, the counterpoint and the given melody's shape would mix together. If the high points did occur at the same time, then the melody would lose some of that independence in the voices. For this example, we are going to create a high point that occurs slightly later than our high point of our given melody. Okay, and as we can see, our high point right here is the note A. Okay, so now from this beginning section, we're just actually going to move on to the high point section. Since we want our counterpoint high point to occur slightly after, we're going to start writing on the high point of the given melody, which is A. One option could be placing C above our A, creating a third, and then moving in contrary motion to a D above our G, creating a fifth, moving in contrary motion again to an E above our C, which is a tenth, our C being our tonic. And this works well because of the counterpoint's overall contrary motion. We do have that perfect consonant interval in there, but we are approaching it in contrary motion, and we're also leaving it in contrary motion. And the two intervals that surround it are pretty similar, because first we have a third, then second we have a tenth, which is just like a third, but spread out the upper voice an extra octave. And then there's also the fact that the two melodies around this area have the sense of rising in energy, except one keeps rising and one dips off. This is a good method to work by when composing your own counterpoint, starting with the ending since it'll be the same for all one-to-one counterpoint exercises. And that would be unfortunate to create a really good counterpoint only to realize that you can't lead up to the ending in any way, and you have to completely redo something. After creating the ending, which in this case we simply just did that cadence, now we create a beginning which will enable room for both of the melodies to be able to develop into their high point. Then create a high point where it'll work best or be the most effective while you still have a free piece and not other notes causing it to be more restrictive. And now you have the three major points. You have a beginning, you have an ending, and you also have the high point worked out, and now you just have to fill in the gaps. Of course, using the rules that we discussed. We can start by filling in the later gap, which is in between the counterpoint's high point. If we look at the given melody, it goes from our tonic up a step, goes up a leap, it goes down 2 steps, and now we are already finished in this area where we have this ending cadence to our final octave. So we want to fill in the gap between E and B while simultaneously complementing the shape of this melody. An example could be from that C and that E, creating that 10th, we move in contrary motion to a D and a D, creating a perfect octave. Then we move in contrary motion again to F and A, creating a third. So just to back up a little bit, when we have our 10th going down to our octave, we're going in contrary motion, going down a step and up a step. So it's just a step. And then when we go in contrary motion to our third, we're actually leaping. So as you can see, we're no longer going just up or down a step. Then again, we have contrary motion from our F and our A, which then goes to our E to our C. There's a leap in the upper voice, and then it just goes down a step in the bottom voice. So as you can see, there are 2 leaps here, and the leap between D and A is not recovered in stepwise motion, and this is fine because this is actually a leap going down. And the gap between D and A gets filled in by the next notes. So now we just have this gap left over, which from where we left off, we have a leap going down, a leap going back up, and then 2 steps going down, and with another leap going back up. This is more tricky, but there are a lot of things that we can do. One idea could be, first we leap in contrary motion, creating an octave of 2 Cs, and then we go in contrary motion again, creating a third of G and B. Then we move in parallel motion, going to a third of F and A. Next, in contrary motion to E and B. Then finally, we go in similar motion to A and C, which forms a third. This idea works just fine, however we can make it better. The counterpoint to our given melody's high point A in similar motion could have a stronger approach that accents our high point more. One motion earlier, the 5th between E and B, is weak in function. It sounds the harmony of a third chord, and this third chord does not have a strong chord function and therefore can be thought of as ambiguous. Technically, this section of counterpoint follows all the given rules and is correct in its nature, but as you can see, we still find some things that could be improved to make this a stronger counterpoint, make the voices more independent, and also lead up to that high point in the given melody a little bit better and accent it more, so we can hear it more. Okay, so now here's a different solution for that same section. We start by stepping in contrary motion to a 6th, which is C and A. Then we step in similar motion to a third, which is G and B. Then we leap in contrary motion to a 6th, which is F and D. Next, we step in parallel motion, creating another 6th, which is E and C. Finally, we use oblique motion, repeating that same note C. This ending causes the given melody's high point to be approached in oblique motion, forming a third with A and C. If we take a look at our complete counterpoint melody, we will see that it has a slightly similar goal-directed motion starting from the beginning tone to its high point, followed by a release of our high point's tension by leading us smoothly back to scale degree 1 for the ending. These 2 melodies are highly independent of each other and create some good melodic voice leading. You can realize most of this by looking at the entire exercise written out in its full form. It appears we have concluded the exercises, but for now the most important part, do these 2 voices sound good together? First, we have to listen to the given melody and the counterpoint melody separately, and then listen to them together. Okay, so here's the given melody by itself, and then after I'm going to play the counterpoint by itself. Okay, so now let's listen to them together. Sounds good to me, and credits to Jacob Grans for creating that counterpoint. I'm pretty sure he created that. I'm just taking what I have from my notes, redoing it, so props to him. And now for personal work on the subject. 1 is complete several of these composition exercises to become more familiar with the concept and rules. Below are 2 cantus firmus, first in major, second in minor. Create 4 total solutions for these given melodies, 1 above and below the cantus firmi. Of course, making sure to follow the rules and the guidelines discussed earlier. Alright, so here are those 2 exercises, the first one being in major and the second one being in minor, using C major and A minor. And now the second thing you can do to help improve your skills is to develop a better sense of audiation through an audiation exercise. Memorize the given melody, the cantus firmus, and be able to play it in your head without looking at the score or referencing anything. First, you can imagine the melody sung in your own voice using solfege syllables. Then imagine it played on an instrument. Try replicating the exact melody without singing or playing it out loud. Now we can attempt to look back at the exercise and hear both the given melody as well as the counterpoint playing simultaneously in your head. Don't just hear their intervals in their state of intervallic relationship, but instead hear the combined scale degrees creating that interval. So instead of just hearing a third or a sixth, you're hearing scale degrees 1 and 3. So in C major, we're going to have C and E creating a third. Then let's say we have scale degrees 7 and 5, creating a sixth between B and G. Hear each interval at a time before moving on to the next interval to really understand the nature of its sound. Go back and try to audiate the interval together as precisely as you can, going from one note to the next, starting from beginning to end. Of course, start in smaller portions and work up from there. After some time, you will be able to audiate the whole exercise in your head. Don't worry about the actual rhythms at this point. We really just want to hear those scale degrees being used. This is not an easy process and it'll take time and dedication. Also, this will become much more difficult as we develop into more complex forms of species counterpoint, eventually adding a third voice. Audiation was something that the well-known classical composers developed in a very thoughtful manner. 3 is prepare analytic diagrams of the composition exercises. In math, we are taught it is important to create an answer to a problem, but it is also important to show your work of how you got there, as well as be able to analyze your method and make sure that it's being done correctly. Analytic diagrams can be used in the nature of showing your work in these counterpoint exercises. To create an analytic diagram to these one-to-one exercises, there are only 3 steps to follow. First, use a dotted slur to connect any repeated tones together. This highlights points of oblique motion in the exercise, and you can only have oblique motion in the counterpoint, so you're only going to find that in the counterpoint. This is something rarely used, so you should not see a lot of this in your response. And in this case, you can see this is only here 1 time. Okay, second, we use solid slurs to connect any consonant leaps in the exercise. This is a good time to double check to make sure that the leaps are in fact a consonant interval. Now we can visually interpret repeated tones and consonant leaps, as well as see how many there are and where they are, and we can compare that to our stepwise motion, so we can see the contradiction of each, as well as the differences in the counterpoint and the given melody. So now we can see that the stepwise motion are all of the notes without a dotted slur or a slur between them. Last, we're going to label the harmonic intervals between the 2 voices, which I already did, as you can see, but that would be the last step in the analytic diagram. Make sure that you double check that all of the perfect consonances are approached by either contrary motion or oblique motion. You can always circle the perfect consonances where we just label the harmonic intervals. At this point, this is a very simple level of counterpoint, and therefore our analytic diagram seems like it is simple and easy. But in the future, we will be going over multiple rhythmically free melodies written against our given melody. At that point, these analytic diagrams will become extremely important. Okay, so now let's analyze this now that we have the analytic diagram written. So as you can see, there's nothing written between these first two intervals. So you can see the top voice and the lower voice are both stepping in contrary motion, but they're both in stepwise motion. Next, you can see we move in parallel motion, and next we move in parallel motion using stepwise motion. So both of our voices just move up a step, still remaining the same interval of a third. Next, we do move in contrary motion. Our bottom voice does move a leap of a third, so we do have that slurred, but the upper voice only moves in stepwise motion up a step. This creates a sixth interval. Next, from the sixth interval, it goes to the next interval using similar motion where the bottom voice leaps up a fifth where it is slurred, and the top voice just moves up a step, creating a third interval. Next, from the third, we move in contrary motion. Our upper voice moves up a third, and you can see it's slurred. Our bottom voice moves down a step, creating a sixth interval. Next, we move in parallel motion in stepwise motion to another sixth, and because we're doing stepwise motion in both of our voices, nothing's slurred here. Then from the sixth, we do have contrary motion. Something interesting happens where our upper voice is using oblique motion, so we have that dotted slur. Then our bottom voice is moving up a fourth, so we have that solid slur, creating a third interval. From this third interval, it moves in contrary motion to a fifth in stepwise motion. Next, from this third, it moves in contrary motion in stepwise motion to a fifth, and because it's stepwise motion in both voices, again, we don't have any slurs there. And then from the fifth, we move in contrary motion to our 10th interval. Our bottom voice moves down a fifth, while our upper voice moves up a step. Next, we move in contrary motion in stepwise motion to our octave. So this is good because we approach this properly. And therefore, it's going to sound a lot better than if we approach this perfect consonant interval using direct motion by using either similar motion or, even worse, if we used parallel motion. Next, from this octave, you can see that we move in contrary motion and we have a leap in our upper and our lower voice, so we have both those slurs. And then from here, our third moves in contrary motion again, our bottom voice moving in stepwise motion down, and our upper voice moving a leap of a third up, creating a sixth interval. From this sixth, we move to another sixth using parallel motion, and then from this sixth, this is our second to last note, which is using the second degree of the scale and the seventh degree of the scale, creating this interval, which is setting up the cadence of this octave at the very end. So again, we're moving in contrary motion to our perfect consonant interval, ending the piece on two of our tonic notes. Okay, there we have it. The counterpoint has been completed. The analytic diagram has been completed. We can now see and observe and analyze the counterpoint versus the given melody. We can see the fact that we mostly use thirds and sixths. That is a very common thing here. We do have a fifth here. We do start with a fifth. We do have one octave right here. And we also have a 10th here, which I was telling you is very similar to a third because it's using the same notes as a third, except the upper note is just up an octave. So for the most part, harmonically, we only have one octave in here. Other than that, we have our thirds and our sixths, and we have that 1/10. And of course, we have the octave at the very end, completing the piece, telling us that this is over.